afternoon, St Helens. Miss Chappell here for the next part of story time, and we've been reading the Twits, and we got to chapter 7, the Wormy Spaghetti. And if you remember, I set you the challenge of thinking what could happen next, because we know Mr. and Mrs. Twit are playing tricks on each other. So I wonder what one they will play a trick on who in chapter 7, the Wormy Spaghetti. So let's see what happens next in the next part of our story. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog tricks, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking around with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms in. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it all up, will you? It's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around the fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "Not as good as the other ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I found it rather bitty," he said with a mouthful. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful and it was empty. Then she said, "You want to know why the spaghetti was squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it had a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said again. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet and rocking with horrible laughter. Chapter 8, the funny walking stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back. So they keep playing all these different tricks on each other. So I wonder what's going to happen next. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in the spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the woman was asleep downstairs, he crept out of bed and took her walking sticks downstairs to his work shed. There, he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, on the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small, the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood, except every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness on the wood of the walking stick. He did it very neatly, so the extra bits looked like a part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it is almost impossible to notice it. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day. It's happening so slowly, you can't even notice it from one week to the other. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, yes, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't wait for the life of me to think what it was." There's something all wrong, all right, Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. What can have happened? Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. It must have suddenly grown larger. Don't be a fool, Mr. Twit said. How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood. Dead wood can't grow. Then what on earth is happening? Cried Mrs. Twit. It's not a stick. It's you, said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing for some time now. You're getting smaller. You're a shrinking woman. Never, she cried. Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks. Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly, she had to sit down. Chapter 9. Mrs. Twit has the shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, There you are, there you are. You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much, your feet aren't even touching the ground. Mrs. Twit looked at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he had been with the walking stick. Every night when he'd gone downstairs and stuck a little bit of extra on the stick, he had done the same for the 4 legs of Mr. Twit's chair. Just look at you sitting in that chair, he cried, and you shrunk so much your feet can't even touch the ground. Mrs. Twit went white with fear. You've got the shrinks, Mr. Twit said, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of shrinks I've ever seen. Mrs. Twit became so frightened, she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks, he said. Your head shrinks into your neck shrinks into your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet. And in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes. I can't bear it, said Mrs. Twit. It's a terrible disease, said Mr. Twit. The worst in the world. How long have I got? Cried Mrs. Twit. How long before I finish a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes? Mr. Twit stopped slowly and put on a solemn face. At the rate you're going, he said, shaking his head sadly, I think you've got about 10 to 11 days. But there isn't anything we can do, cried Mrs. Twit. There's only one cure for the shrink, said Mr. Twit. Tell me, she cried. Tell me quickly. We'll have to hurry, said Mr. Twit. I'm ready. I'm hurry. I'll do anything. You won't last long if you don't, sighed Mr. Twit, giving another gristle. What must I do? Cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. Tell me, quickly. Mr. Twit stopped, looked at her. You've got to be stretched. And we'll leave it there for today and see what happens in the next chapter. And Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Keep reading as much as possible. We know reading is so magical, opens up so many doors, learn so many different words. And I hope you've enjoyed tonight's story time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.